Good afternoon. I'm Ann Aylward, Director of the U.S. Department of Transportation's Volpe Center. Welcome to the 7th program in our 8-part thought leadership series on delivering the benefits of the bipartisan infrastructure law, brought to you by U.S. DOT's Project Delivery Center of Excellence at the Volpe Center. Today's session is the second of 2 sessions focused on accelerating project delivery through innovative procurement, partnerships, and financing methods. 2 weeks ago, we heard from A.D. Tomer, Senior Fellow at Brookings, Maria Lehman, President of the American Society of Civil Engineers, and Morteza Farajan, Executive Director of U.S. DOT's Build America Bureau. If you missed part 1, please check out the recording and recap on our website. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome 3 additional speakers. Brad Wiefrich, Director of Michigan DOT, Susan Shaw, Vice President for Major Program Development at ATCS, and Mike Johnson, Senior Vice President, Infrastructure Market and Strategy at Hewitt. Our first speaker, Brad Wiefrich, was appointed Director of the Michigan DOT in May 2023 after serving in several key positions at MDOT during his distinguished career, most recently as the Chief Operations Officer and Chief Engineer. Brad, the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you very much, and appreciate being with you all today as I work to share my screen. Fantastic. So just a couple of projects that I'd kind of like to talk to you folks today about that I think dovetail nicely with this conversation. The first one is our I-375 Reconnecting Community Project in Detroit. So the green dashed line that you see there shown as Route A is what is currently I-375. It's a depressed freeway that runs about a mile from I-75, which is the blue Route B up there, down towards the downtown riverfront. The intention is to actually replace the depressed freeway with an at-grade boulevard. Obviously, like it says, we're going to have to reconfigure some interchanges, work on Route C, which is Gratiot Avenue, which is a major trunk line coming into the city. But we're also going to be working on some stormwater initiatives and opportunity with the excess property for future development and placemaking. So the new boulevard, we're getting rid of what is essentially a straight shot interchange or interstate rather into the downtown area to something that's at grade and going to be able to provide much more connectivity. We'll have quite a bit of developable excess property. A lot of opportunity for transit and multimodal aspects to be implemented into the project. So a lot of space here to kind of grow new ideas in right near downtown Detroit. The interchanges, the I-75 currently, it's a little strange when you're coming south on 75, the through movement is actually on 375 into downtown. You literally have to exit to stay on I-75. We're going to be flip-flopping some of that to make it much more intuitive. And along with that, we'll be able to provide some more direct connections to some of the more frequented areas of the city, as well as hooking up some of the multimodal aspects, especially the bike lanes. So I-375, like many other projects in the past that we have probably heard of, decimated some historical African-American communities. We had Paradise Valley and Black Bottom were 2 rather thriving communities when the decisions were made back in the 50s to route the freeways through there. So this project really is going to have an equity focus to it. I think we'll always say that we'll never be able to right a wrong, but we know that we have some work to do to make sure that we're acknowledging some of the social and environmental justice issues here. Kind of 4 focus areas. Obviously, we want to focus on all modes, and by bringing this roadway up to grade gives us a lot more of that opportunity. really want to work with the small businesses and DBEs, disadvantaged businesses, and work on workforce development, especially with those folks that are local in Detroit. We'll be developing the community enhancement plan, which is really a plan that we'll prepare kind of in conjunction with the city of Detroit and our local community advisory groups on what they really want to see here. And we'll look at a framework plan as well that's really going to help us most appropriately design this thing and ensure that we're acknowledging the history, making sure that we're doing the multimodal connections that we said we're going to be doing. The development of those plans will be happening later this fall, actually. So opportunity-wise, project, we did get about $100 million infra grant for this. We call it a reconnecting communities. Wasn't specifically reconnecting communities, but infra with the dollar on this project was a bit more appropriate. By getting that grant, now we're able to accelerate that work up into 2025. We're at the kind of the base plan stage right now, and we will be going progressive design build with this project. We haven't done a progressive design build yet. We actually have a couple in the hopper right now, but by getting the contractor and design team on early and being able to work through the progressive iterative process, we think we're best going to be able to respond to the issues around DBE and local contracting and workforce development and really engagement on the traffic operations during design so that we can implement something most efficient in construction. I will tell you the Greektown area with some very significant businesses is right along this route. There's a lot of concern from those groups. And I think by using this progressive model, we'll be able to have that engagement up front before construction to really most effectively address their issues. And obviously with utility coordination and some of the other things that are part of the project, progressive design build just really seems to be a good fit. So the other project I wanted to mention real quickly is I-75 modernization. This is up in Oakland County, roughly 10 miles north of downtown Detroit. Full disclosure, this project all started before the bipartisan infrastructure law, but I think it incorporates a lot of the concepts and philosophies that the IIJA is trying to get to. So we originally decided we were going to do this in 9 separate contracts over 18 years. It was the only way we could really afford it at the time. As you see, this would have been a build out from 2016 all the way to 2034 by the time the thing was done. We walked back and said, no, we got to do things differently. And we ended up, the first 2 segments were fairly manageable, regular design build contracts to get the north portion of this work done. The more innovative segment is actually the furthest south there, segment 3, where we used a design build finance maintain option with that 30-year term that will include maintenance by the concessionaire. So just some of the innovations that we're looking at, this is just a geometric innovation. Right now, there's kind of a gridlock from the 696 ramp to northbound 75. There's currently a conflict with the northbound 75 off ramp there at 11 Mile Road. We've kind of flip-flopped some of the elevation in there to provide for movements that are much less conflicted. This was a big crash area, a big area of congestion. 696, these are probably 2 of our heaviest volume routes in the state. This was a big crowd pleaser for our public. Another thing we're looking at from the stormwater and resiliency perspective, this is about a 14-foot diameter tunnel, runs about 5 miles, 4.5, 5 miles underneath the service drives on 75. With the intention, again, of kind of holding the stormwater and not overflowing the system in the very near area. I actually got to go down and take a tour inside of this thing. It's pretty pretty exciting. It's going to be able to hold over 25 million gallons of water until it's eventually pumped out into a county drain. More geometric improvements as well. I can remember driving through my first divergent diamond interchange thinking that it was going to be very odd driving on the wrong side of the road. But as we've seen, as we've implemented these, I don't know, we have a handful of these around the state now, but if they're signed and aligned and striped correctly, provide for some very good, efficient operations and movements through these high traveled interchanges. And I-75, this segment has our first high occupancy vehicle lane. That was part of an outcome of the environmental classification that we would implement this to help with congestion. It is a new lane that we've added in each direction and will only be enforced during the peak hours. So this project really, like I said, kind of incorporated a lot of the things that we're talking about from an operations standpoint, from an innovative contracting standpoint, from a resiliency standpoint. It's really been kind of one of our poster child projects. As a matter of fact, I think we're opening the northbound HOVs, I think are opening as we speak right now. So that was all. I just wanted to give you a little flavor for some of the things we're doing in Michigan and appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Brad. Very interesting presentation. And I should have said at the beginning, we will be having a Q&A session at the end of the three speakers. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many as we can. Our next speaker is Susan Shaw. Susan recently joined ATCS, an engineering consulting firm based in Northern Virginia, as a vice president and subject matter expert in major program development. Prior to joining ATCS, she led the Virginia DOT Mega Projects Office in Northern Virginia, where she was responsible for over $5 billion worth of projects. Susan?
Thank you, Ann. And when Ann says recently, I will just say it's I'm on day 2 at ATCS, so I'm going to be speaking from the owner's perspective. And so, I haven't quite transitioned to being on the private sector side. So I wanted to really focus on partnering through project delivery and talk about some of our experience that we've had here in Virginia. On the next slide, you can see the Northern Virginia, a map of the Northern Virginia area. If you can advance to the next slide. Thank you. That shows our express lanes network here in Northern Virginia. And our network includes HOV3 travels for free, and we have managed lanes, so adjusted tolling as congestion dictates. So you can see that we've got quite a network, and there we have listed the length of miles. We have over 90 miles now in service. And so this network is providing a consistent ride in the region, but also a space for transit to operate with known travel times. In terms of partnering, which you can see on the next slide, I wanted to talk just a little bit about partnering with across the delivery. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. For both looking at how you partner during project development, as you develop scope and scale for your projects, partnering during procurement, which is very critical to having a good contract, and then also partnering during design and construction. And in terms of, who are we partnering with? And again, I'm speaking from the, owner side, but looking at partnering with our internal organizations, looking at partnering with the public, and then also with the industry. And that goes across all of those 3 areas of project development. So in terms of during project development, on the next slide, we'll focus on partnering within an agency. And typically these large projects, can you go to the next slide? These large projects require a new project team that might have specialized experience. The existing organization chart may not really fit. You kind of need to develop a new organization and develop a review and approval process. You may need specialized experience. And, you know, some agencies have embedded within that project team, typically consultant support. But it's also important that that new project team interact with the existing agency. And so that, and the organizational structure that's already in place. So often we see an owner team augmented to maximize continuity, maintain flexibility, and then to integrate, you know, with the owner, because typically once these projects are completed, you may not need, you know, that project team. But having expertise in risk assessment for these special projects, the contracts are often more complex, especially if you're doing a P3 type agreement where you're including operation and maintenance as part of the overall contract. In addition to, you know, once you've got your project team during development, on the next slide, you can see it's also important to have alignment with key audiences. And this, for 66 outside the Beltway, we developed a technical advisory group that included our key public and agency partners. So this is more on the technical side, where we included the Federal Highway Administration. We had a number of transit partners because that was an important part of our express lanes that we were developing. So we worked with our transit partners to identify where would good access points be, and what types of features we needed to include within our overall project scope. We also worked with the Park Service, and local parks, as well as local jurisdictions, and working within those agencies for both transportation plans. We looked at utilities and stormwater. All of those groups were important as we developed the overall scope of the project. And then outside of those technical groups, on the next slide, is working with public partners, and there would be elected officials as well as direct impact communities, as well as certain user groups like bike advocacy groups, trail advocacy groups, just a number of groups that are also interested in the scope, scale, and impact of any project that you develop. And so getting those communications channels established. We also looked at transportation modes and made sure that we incorporated goals of the region so that we could gain local support for the overall project. And so just an example on the next slide, incorporating multimodal travel. So one of the important things was to have as a goal of the project to move more people, not to move more vehicles. And that's where our HOV3 policy comes into play, as well as incorporating into the project park and ride lots, which have direct access into the express lanes. You can see a parking garage there that's at a transit center hub, and that transit center hub has connections to and from, it's generally located, this is on 66, in the middle of the corridor, and you can access either the east or the west to the express lane. So getting that direct access is critical to making transit an attractive option in the corridor. And we also, in our project, identified funding needs and then incorporated those needs within the overall financial structure of the contract. And so we actually embedded requirements for people, for the developer to pay for transit operating costs on an annual basis It's a set amount through the life of the 50-year contract. And, we looked at those existing regional plans and goals. One of the things in this quarter is that in the eastern 2 miles of this 22-mile corridor for 66, we have the metro system, heavy rail system that runs. In the future, it's planned to extend through Fairfax County. And so we incorporated the space for that transit use. We use the metro's requirements in terms of establishing that footprint. It's one of my pet peeves that we kind of say, well, this project was a highway project versus a transit project. We looked at our $2.3 billion cost and estimated about 400 million went to widening out that space, which is really, unused in 20 miles of the corridor, but we built longer bridges, we bought more right-of-way, we located our access points at future metro stations based on plans. So there was a lot of infrastructure investment in future transit for the region with the project. Okay, next slide. And then, working through public and agency outreach, we had many meetings. Here's some examples of just some traditional broader meetings. You could see the numbers. And then on the next slide, we also attended community events anywhere we could get out there. And then we met with many direct impact and advocacy groups, HOAs. We met in cul-de-sacs, in homes, in garages, in carports, wherever people would have us. We met to hear their concerns and to listen and to incorporate where we could. So another group that's important to coordinate with is the industry. And so on the next slide, that's one of the things I think that was very innovative about how we procured our project. We did start very early in 2013 with some outreach, doing some requests for information just to see if there was interest, to get feedback. And so that helped to establish some scope and other parameters, making sure that when we did go out with an RFP, that it would be something that we would get good competition on. So that's critical and starts very early in the process. On the next slide, I am not going to really go through this slide. I think I could do a 2-day course just on this slide probably, but this just shows on the top bar our environmental process, and on the in the green, and on the orange down below is our P3 procurement process. And so you can just see that those did occur concurrently. There are a couple of places where those dashed lines, it's very critical what occurs, before or after each other, where you do have to kind of have a hold point in the process. But I think for, doing something that's effective from a timeline and schedule standpoint, it can be done. And I think when you're partnering successfully, it helps to smooth this process out so that you don't have some glitchiness of, not having the right input that would slow you down. And so next, on the next slide, just briefly talk a little bit about our procurement. This was very innovative for us. We actually issued 3 RFQs in September of 2015, and we issued across 3 delivery methods. So design build with an option to operate and maintain, and then a design build, operate, maintain that also included financing, your typical P3. And so we received qualifications from all of those teams. We also requested an indicative financial proposal, kind of conceptual at a high level, that was also received. And that submissions then helped us to analyze what was the best of those three options for the public. And we did end up choosing a P3 option, but we always kept the public option on the table to make sure we got the best option. And moving to the next slide, you can see there how we worked through that. We had 3 firms that submitted on the finance option, 5 on the operate and maintain, and 5 on the just traditional design build. They were basically all the same teams. So the 3 teams that submitted on finance also submitted on the other 2 methods. And then there were 2 teams that did not submit on financing. They only submitted on the design build two methods. We did provide stipends to responsive shortlisted teams for the if they were on the delivery methods that were not selected. So in terms of delivery on projects, I think there it's also important to continue that partnering. And if you go to the next slide. So here we're moving into, once you've got your delivery, what are you doing to partner internally? Design reviews and oversight, those are very critical for keeping the project moving forward. We had commitments within the agreement. We also were actively doing risk assessment throughout the project. We had a number of management tools that we used within the project. One thing I think that was really important and effective was that we worked together to identify and resolve issues as partners, and that included partnering internally, but also with our private partner as well. And then keeping your executive team involved. These are typically big projects. The decisions are can have big consequences. And so keeping executives informed of progress and anything that might affect schedule or cost is critical. In terms of partnering with our public, if you go to the next slide. So we did have monthly coordination meetings with the 2 major counties. We had weekly meetings with our team from Metro, their rail system. They had 2 stations within our footprint, as well as pedestrian and stations right in the middle of our corridor. So there was quite a bit of coordination with them. We had a number of recurring meetings with the Park Service, local parks, utilities, a number of key agencies that we worked with in the corridor. And I think, we tried very hard to focus our meetings to identify what the issue was, resolve the issue, and then assign action and make sure we were taking action. And so that also is really critical to have a successful project delivery. On the next slide, aligning, public and private goals is always important, and this, and I think those might change as time, as you're delivering your project. This slide just talks about, the impact that we had with COVID, that big dip in travel volumes in the quarter in April of 2020. And so we had a contract where we required 4 lanes of open lanes during peak periods at all times, and so or at all peak periods. And what we saw in that April downturn, and then we really didn't come back from that. We were significantly lower, and so we were able to actually relax the contract requirements. And that was in the interest of the public, because it meant that the project could get done more quickly. There was less traffic out there. And so that was one of those win-wins. And I think, as you move through your project, things will happen and you'll need to adjust. And this is an example of that in this quarter. And then lastly, just, by doing all of that, you get these key milestones. So, July 2014 was when we launched our plan to fix 66. We had a signing in December of 2016, groundbreaking 2017, and then on the bottom right, we opened slightly ahead of schedule November 2022 with our ribbon cutting. And with that, I will turn it back over to Anne.
Thank you, Susan. Really interesting presentation. And I knew it had been recent, but I didn't realize this was actually your second day. We thank your new employer for making you available.
Yes.
So our final speaker is Mike Johnson. Mike is the Senior Vice President of Markets and Strategy of Kiewit Infrastructure Group, part of the Kiewit Corporation, focused on integrated delivery. Mike brings more than 30 years of executive management experience in the industry, and he comes to us today from Buffalo. Mike, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Ann. Really appreciate it. And there's some common themes that we've heard between the first two presentations from Brad and Susan alike. And we talk about project and schedule certainty, keeping the commitments that you make to your communities. And really, it's how we serve this infrastructure bill is going to set the stage for the future. So if you go to the next slide, please. I think the 480 participants and the folks that are on this panel can all attest that there is stress in the system right now. There's a lot on our shoulders with regards to delivery, another $20 to $22 billion being placed into the system. Our friends at ARPA keep very close track of what's been put out. And you can see as we continue through the various fiscal years, the jump across the board. And I believe that the agencies alike, they want to have different delivery methods in their toolbox. They want portfolio balance to progress forward and to obviously secure and execute on the funding. Next slide. So I think without a doubt, if we look at the history of the last 15 or 20 years, complex projects, all contractors, designers, there's been challenges. There's been challenges across the board. And a lot of that starts, in my opinion, with risk sharing and transparency. There's always going to be the need, and of course, design, build, delivery method. It's the most common method amongst agencies, and that's good, certainly for what I'll call less complex projects. But as we start to get into complex projects that have, whether it's third-party agreements, whether it's railroads or utilities, or the need to be sure that the communities, our stakeholders, their goals are being met and the objectives that they have, engagement is all being met by the design build team. Next slide. So to cover a few of these, I'm going to talk a bit about CMGC and progressive design build. And then I'm sure a future class will cover integrated project delivery or alliancing, which is really an advent coming from Australia and others, if you will, specifically in the Gulf Coast communities. Next. So this should not come as a surprise. The most important thing that we can do on a project is get your designer and your contractor aligned early on. And there are a number of folks that are seated at the table, from stakeholders to owners. And the earlier that we can start these complex or mega projects, the better product we're going to have. And the further we wait, the chances of being able to influence cost and schedule become far less. So whether it's progressive or it's CMGC, pulling those to the table early is going to drive innovation. It's also going to put discipline and rigor into the system to make sure that goals are being met in a consistent basis. Next slide. So covering CMAR, it's a very simple structure. The owner typically hires an engineer a few months in front of hiring their contractor. And the contractor sets up its subcontracts and other consultants, such as a geotech, and sets that particular program in motion. And next slide. And I think what's important is the risk allocation. Now, This is something that's very common. And at the end of the day, when it comes to alternative delivery, understanding risk allocation and risk registers is imperative. And on CMGC, there's a lot of shared risk, whether it's construction permits, utilities, third-party permits, but the design, if you will, is tilted to the left side. The owner owns about 75% of that design. The challenges that come with CMGC really start in and around the guaranteed maximum price, and understanding that that the owners will bring in an independent contractor is important in developing what I'll call credible cost estimates. And the CMGC projects that become contentious, it's typically around budgets. And how can we align that risk allocation closer with the owner's expectations on budget? Next slide. And we believe a solution on the big projects is certainly progressive. And it's a collaborative model, and you'll hear us talk quite a bit about that. But it's the perfect solution for projects that are complex. Specifically when you're making commitments, Brad talked about the commitments that he's made and connecting communities. Susan's proved it throughout Virginia, whether it was I-66 or Midtown Tunnel. There are a lot of communities and a lot of stakeholders that had goals and objectives, and those were aligned as one team progressing forward. Next. And typically how that contract is aligned is the owner has one accountable design builder. So that design builder comes in, you've got subcontractors and suppliers, the engineering team's all on board, and sub-consultants are all progressing as one delivery partner. Next. And you can see how the risk has shifted a little bit. The design risk shifts from basically 75% in CMGC for the owner to 75%, if you will, under the contractor itself. Third-party permitting also slides to the right. Utilities are split 50-50. Geotech remains the same. And we believe that this is a great model across the board, specifically for complex jobs. Next. So as far as what we get out of this, every project that we look at, and on the progressive design build, we have two large projects progressing right now. One is with the Valley Transit in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's greater than $2.5 billion under progressive. It's in what I call the first phase. So there's a phase 1 and a phase 2 of these programs. And the team is really focused on innovation, driving down costs, and getting certain long lead items out and ready to the market. And I think the advantage is that the client, as well as the contractor, have here is there's off-ramps. If those goals and objectives are not being met, they'll obviously deliberate over how best to make that happen. But if they're not being achieved, there's off-ramps where we can take that in a different direction. We can go design build, we can go design bid build, we can break up the project into smaller pieces, and we can press that out on the market. Next, please. And really, if it's CMGC or CMAR, Brad mentioned the iterative process. And if you see that circle in the middle, design development, cost, schedule development, these are all about confirming that the project goals are being met. And every step along the way, you're aligned with your client. And I believe that's one of the challenges we have when you have a newer agency that's used to either design bid build or design build. The old adage of us versus them is out the window. This is a collaboration. A lot of it is based on the partnering experience that those that have been in the industry since, say, 1990, that was developed and brought forward and really became the advent of our design build programs and strategies throughout the industry. This takes it one step further. And whether the main word is collaborative, I think the main word in all these projects that drive success is transparency. Transparency with the clients and transparency with the design builder alike are going to bring project success. All these projects come to a guaranteed maximum price submission. And obviously, the further along the design is, as well as the goals and commitments that we have within the communities, the better price certainty becomes. Next. And with regards to risk mitigation, at the end of the day, the early subcontractor engagement, the mitigations that we have along the way, all right, provide you price, and risk is facilitated during design development. I believe the work plans, the pricing and schedule are jointly and transparently worked through, and the design pricing is advanced. And as you can tell from the graph on the right, there's really no explanation, and we're driving risk out of the project at an earlier time, and the more risk that we can pull out, the better the project we can have. Next. So from my perspective, Kiewit wants to deliver great projects, and I commend agencies like Michigan and the Commonwealth of Virginia for its transparent and delivery insight. I know Virginia certainly has been a leader throughout the years in what I'll call progressive approaches to alternative delivery, and Michigan has obviously got on board, and under Brad's leadership, we expect more alternative delivery for the industry unto itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. That brings us to the end of our prepared presentations. We can now move into the Q&A session. Thank you, those of you who have posted questions in the course of the presentations, and others, please feel free to do so now. Susan has been very enterprisingly answering questions in the chat on her own, but I'm going to ask some of them anyway, just to get a broader discussion of them. So first question goes to Brad. The VDOT presentation mentioned the transit, bike, and walk improvements associated with projects in Northern Virginia. Did MDOT do any of that with the I-75 modernization? The questioner grew up in Shelby Township, Michigan, next to that project.
Yeah, there wasn't as much opportunity for that on the 75 project as there is for 375. Obviously, 375 being kind of in more of that urban core area, there'll be a lot of involvement with non-motorized. 75, I think they looked at some of the crossings and a little bit on the layout of the service drives, but I would say overall, it wasn't that much of a focus on I-75 as it was our 375 project.
Thank you very much. A question for you, Mike. Roger Cohen asks if you can share specific strategies that effectively drive risk out of the project.
Sure. Well, we refer to them as tiger teams. So you take the series of design disciplines with your estimators and your various owner representatives. You put them in and you break down that project. Every big project is really a series of smaller projects put together. So you take these discipline leads, you put them in rooms, and you allow them to innovate. And you work closely. I like to use the term dynamic tension. There's dynamic tension in those rooms, all right, whether it's cost, materials, supply, logistics. But what we're really trying to do is drive value. If we can drive best value for each one of the disciplines on the project, the better the price is going to be and the more certain you'll have with regards to schedule.
Thank you. Couple of questions about finance. First one to Susan. How did you finance the I-66 and I-95 projects?
So all of these, both of those projects were done with a P3 model, and it was a revenue risk project that relied on the tolling over a long period of time. For 95, it was about a 75-year term for that contract. It is completely, revenue risk. There were TIFIA loans as part of the overall financing, and on 95 there was some public funding as well. I believe about $90 million, as I recall. On 66, same kind of features there, where the toll operator or the private partner will take the risk on the toll revenue. Now, they also have the ability to set tolls and the freedom to set tolls, how they would like, as long as they maintain speeds. And they also have the HOV3 or greater travel for free. And in that project, we actually received a concession fee payment at the beginning of the project of $579 million that went towards other improvements in the corridor, and there was not a public subsidy for that project. That one is a 50-year life for that development term.
Thank you. And Brad, there's an observation that $100 million grant is a lot, but I'm sure you'll need more. How do you plan to fill the gap?
That is exactly right. $100 million is a lot, but this job is upwards of, 300 to 400 million probably by the time it's done. I guess fortunately, we had already kind of been pulling funds together and had it in our regular program in 2007. So we're going to be able to move some of that money that we intended to spend in 2027 up to 2025 to meet the grant timeframes. And that's just our regular program funds, state and federal aid.
Thank you very much. For all of you, Peter Rogoff observes that there's no question that owners often have historical and cultural challenges in getting to a spirit of collaboration with contractors under these alternative delivery methods. But are there methods that the contractors can take on transparency of their pricing approach to build greater confidence and trust on the part of the owners?
We'll start
You
from an
want
open
that
book
one, Mike?
perspective.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think it all starts, again, I use the word transparent and trust. And as a contractor that's worked on multiple progressive design builds and CMGCs, you have to be willing to go open book. You sit down with your client. If there are questions with regards to, oh, we think you're high on price. Okay, here it is. Let's walk through each one of the elements in the estimate. Let's see where the differences are. And it's apples to apples. It's just not comments and throwing darts. So I think, Susan, you had brought up the partnering approach, really was the advent, if you will, coming out of Arizona and Utah years ago, and then carried all the way across the country. A lot of that, a lot of the progressive build scenarios that we have in place today are based on those very same principles.
Brad or Susan,
I'll tell you.
observations?
I was just going to say, from our perspective, I think we learned that in our first CMGC project we did many years ago now. But yeah, it was a great experience to be able to sit down, like Mike said, with an open book and really understand, what costs were in play. We had a disagreement about something, we would sit down and the contractor was able to lay it out. Here's why. Here are the itemized things that are making my price get to this point. At that point, you can have the conversation about, do you need to look at scope, or maybe we balance risk a different way? Do we look at shared risk on some items and whatnot? But really, like Mike said, that open book philosophy, or that open book process that we use in those is extremely valuable.
And I would just say that as an owner agency, there are a lot of levers that can be pulled. Maybe it's additional coordination, additional staffing added to kind of ease the pain of like dealing with utility companies or whatever, the issue is. And I think that being flexible where there's a public benefit, we just need to look at that. So, I gave that example of the lower traffic volumes. I mean, we could have said, no, the contract says 4 lanes, we want 4 lanes, but, there was just such a huge benefit to doing that to the contractor, but also to the public. And, I will say, I think the success of our 66 procurement was on the groundwork that was laid with being reasonable and collaborative on these other projects. So there was an industry expectation that the department, Virginia, was going to manage this contract in that same manner. And I think you get better pricing then when they know that you're going to come at it with that partnering approach. So I think There's a lot of benefit. I mean, I always use as a yardstick, is it in the public interest for us to give on whatever this issue is, or to be flexible or collaborative? And often, there is that benefit.
Yeah, I thank you for your answers. Peter, thank you for the question. I think this is a really important theme that we've seen throughout the series, and an area where owners can really learn from each other, and contractors can help to carry what's worked in one environment to another project environment. So we need to keep having this conversation. Question from Jennifer Marshall, I think probably for all of you. How does the NEPA process influence the progressive design build process? Does it seem to add more time, or is it preferable to have NEPA completed in advance?
I mean, I can start first, and Brad and Susan follow in, but from a design builder's perspective, we'd like to have the NEPA process completed in advance, but that may not be the case, especially in projects that move the needle for communities. That NEPA process may not be finished. And we talked about the iterative process, that circle that was in the one diagram. That NEPA process could be churning right along there. It's the risk allocation on the environmental side, the permitting, that really matters. And I think getting input from your contractor or design builder in this case is really going to drive means and methods, which are also going to drive into the environmental process itself.
So for 375 specifically that we're using progressive on, we did get to a FONSI, finding no significant impact. So that was done, but a lot of the commitments that came out of that were going to take a lot more involvement in discussion and planning with the community. So NEPA technically was done, but actually the implementation of what NEPA required really makes progressive design build for us on that project a good fit.
Anything to add, Susan?
No.
Okay, I think probably a final question, since it's for all of you. For Susan and Brad, you have mostly worked on the owner side. So as an owner, what do you think the most important thing is for the contracting entity to know about how owners think and work? And for Mike, the opposite question, what's the most important thing for owners to know about how contractors think and work?
That's a good question. And I think they kind of go hand in hand. I think one of the things that we've learned as we've developed our innovative contracting program is really about where the risk sits. So I guess if I had to have a conversation with a contractor, a lot of times we look at projects and we know that risk is going to be a factor in their ultimate bid. Just knowing kind of where our mind is and us knowing from them where their risks are and how do we address those, to me would be most valuable.
And I would say just, no matter what the contract says, the public always sees the owner agency as at fault, pretty much, like, why are we not controlling the contractor? And so I think having the contractor understand that our duty to keep the public safe, to, try to minimize inconvenience and to at least convey when that's going to happen ahead of time. And then I think the other thing is that we are bureaucrats. We have our systems and, help, we want to help the contractor. We want them to be successful, but we do have our requirements and systems in place. And, we'll do our best to help make them successful, but they need to pull their weight too. So.
Sure. On the contractor side, and I talked a little bit about the fact in progressive design build, we're on the same side of the ball. So to Brad's point, there are some alignment immediately. One, contractors want to deliver. That's what they want. They want to deliver. They want successful projects. And if there's one element that I think that is a thorn in the side that they don't understand, and Susan nailed it, is the bureaucracy and there are processes in place, but time is money. So when plans are developed or there's needs for reviews in the field, it can't be, hey, we'll get there in the next 21 days. And some contractors don't understand that. That working hard between staff and craft. And I think the more education that you give your clients early on in the discipline in your own system, the better off we all are.
Susan, one last really quick question, and then I'm going to wrap it up. Are there any early lessons learned from the heavy truck tolling along the I-66 OTV express lanes that can be applied to other similar regions and facilities?
I think it's a little bit too early for us because it really has been, a short time period. I don't think, I mean, at least in terms of what I've seen out there anecdotally, it's not a large volume of traffic of truck traffic on it. And I think, we really didn't know. We did look at other corridors. The one thing I would say is that every corridor is very unique in terms of truck traffic. And I think it's hard to draw too many conclusions, I think, from one roadway to another. So, 66 is just completely different than travel on the 95 corridor. Just very, very different. So I would caution drawing too many, conclusions, and we'll see how it goes as we move forward and the system matures. I would say we're still in that ramp up period, though.
Great, that makes sense. Thank you. So my thanks to all of you for a really interesting session today. I'm pleased to announce that our final event in this series will be held on November 15th, 2023 at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, which is the second anniversary of the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Please be aware that the details of this event were just posted. You do need to register separately for it, even if you've attended the other events in the series. This final event will include a message from the Secretary and remarks by Maryland Governor Wes Moore, Dr. Chris Polchowski, I'm sure I just massacred that, Director of Policy and Strategic Initiatives in the City of Philadelphia's Office of Transportation, Infrastructure, and Sustainability, and Tom Nisalki, Airport Assistant General Manager of Planning and Development at the Atlanta Hartsfield Airport. They will each talk about a bill-funded project that's currently underway, project delivery, and project benefits. For those of you of a certain age, and particularly in the Northeast, may remember the infamous Big Dig in Boston. An enterprising reporter at our local public radio and TV station has put together a 7-part podcast on the history of the Big Dig, which raises many of the issues that have come up in this series about delivery of mega projects. And I highly recommend it to all of you. You can find it on YouTube if you just Google Big Dig. So thank you all for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you on November 15th. My thanks again to our terrific speakers. Take care. Have a good afternoon.